Hello and welcome to Ruby Creative. My name is Ru and today I'm showing you how I made my Thor hammer. In this video I'm going to show you how I made my Thor hammer from start all the way through to the finish. This project is probably my favourite to date, so I really hope you enjoy the video. About 50% of the time spent on this project was actually spent drawing the hammer up in CAD. I drew the hammer up in CAD because of the precision required to build the hammer. I wanted nice straight edges and clean, crisp details for the final product. Then, using the file I'd meticulously drawn up, I was able to cut it out on the laser cutter. I don't actually own my own laser cutter, but thanks to a wonderful place in Nottingham called the Hackspace, I was able to use their machines to cut it out. If you're interested in finding out more about the Hackspace, I'll leave a link to their website in the description below. They're based all over the UK and it's a completely non-profit community. These are all the pieces cut out of 5mm foam. Before I could start building the hammer, I needed to make sure that the pieces would fit together flush. To do this, I had to cut some angles on some of the sides of the pieces. The first pieces that I cut angled sides on were the large rectangular pieces. There should be 4 of them, and on each of the long sides I cut a 45-degree angle. The 45-degree angle is just a guesstimate as I was cutting it by hand. As you can see, I only cut angles on the long sides and left the short sides with a nice straight cut. The next ones were the small detail pieces of foam. I cut a 45-degree angle on every single side of these. There should be 8 detail pieces in total. Cutting the angled edges actually took me quite a while, as I had to make sure I lined up the blade exactly with the edge of the foam. I took my time to make sure I didn't cut away any of the foam that I'd need. This is what the back of the detailed pieces looked like once I'd cut angles on all the sides. Finally, I cut angles on the little trapeziums that would be used for all the corners. There should be 8 of these in total. I cut an angle on the short side on the bottom and the long side on the top. These are all the pieces needed with all the angles cut to make the end of the hammer. To attach all the pieces, I used contact adhesive. Once the glue had dried, I very carefully lined up the edges and stuck the pieces together. I worked my way around the edge, doing a detailed side, then a corner, and then another detailed side. This way I made sure all the pieces fit exactly together. I kept going until this was the end result. The inside was a little bit messy, but as long as the outside's nice and clean and it stays in one piece, it doesn't matter. With one piece done, it was time to move on to the second, so that I'd have one piece for each end. After I'd finished both pieces, I used hot glue in all the joints to make them extra strong. Because I didn't want my hammer to be hollow, I filled all the pieces that I built. To fill the 2 end pieces, I took 2 squares of 10mm foam and used contact adhesive to glue them in the middle. I did this for both ends so they looked like this. Finally, to fill in the small gap around the edge, I took some craft clay and smushed it down the sides. I filled it all the way up to in line with the square pieces of foam, and I did this for both end pieces. Putting those pieces to one side, I began work on the main body of the hammer. Taking the bottom piece, which is the piece with 2 horizontal lines running through it, I found the center point and then drew a circle the same circumference as the dowel I'd be using for the handle. Then using my sharp scalpel, I cut the circle out. Then I glued the 2 long rectangular pieces, also with a horizontal line on them, to the side of the base. This is what the base piece should look like. Again, because I didn't want my hammer to be hollow, I'm going to fill it in the same way that I did the end pieces. Taking some 10mm craft foam, I cut it to a similar size as the base. In the same way that I did for the base, I found the center point, drew a circle with the same circumference as the dowel for the handle, and then I cut it out. These holes really don't have to be perfect, as they're going to be in the middle of the hammer and they're not going to be seen by anyone. To double check they'd fit on the dowel, I slid on all the pieces, including the base piece. Before gluing down the 10mm foam, I decided to glue the finished end pieces onto the base. As before, I was very careful to line up the edges very precisely. With the ends in place, I began piling up the 10mm foam, being very careful to line up the hole in the middle. At this point, I felt like it was really starting to come together. Same as I did with the 2 end pieces, I then took some craft clay and filled in all the gaps. Because I wanted my hammer to be really sturdy with no movement, I even glued a piece of 10mm foam to either side. Once I was sure the inside was full to the brim, I glued on the side pieces. Around this point I started to get really nervous because I didn't want to mess anything up. The final part to piece together was the top of the hammer. The top of the hammer is the plain long rectangular piece and 2 smaller rectangular pieces. All that was left was to attach it to the rest of the hammer. This is the fully pieced together hammerhead. Thanks to the AutoCAD document that I made, it was really precise, and because of all the foam in the middle, it was super sturdy. Now to get started on the handle. I cut a strip of 5mm foam the same width as a ruler. Wrapping it around the handle, I cut it to the length that I'd need it. Putting the dowel into the hammerhead, I wrapped the strip around the dowel to see how it would look. Halfway through the width of the foam, I cut a small strip off the bottom of it. I then glued it in place on the dowel using contact adhesive. I wrapped it really tightly and made sure that it was sat flush against the hammerhead. Because I'd not yet attached the dowel, I removed it from the hammerhead for the next part. Finding the centre of the top of the hammer, I placed and glued the small disc that sits on top of the hammer in place. I marked its position and glued it in place using contact adhesive. It was finally time to glue the handle in place. As you can probably tell, I was really happy with it at this point. I wasn't able to get a video of me priming it due to having to do it outside, but this is it after priming. To prime the surface, I used Rust-Oleum Surface Primer. To paint my hammer, I used a mixture of Vallejo colours and Hexflex paints. I applied these with my airbrush for a nice even coat. Whilst the paint settled, I began work on the wrap for the handle. I cut strips of leather with a width of 2.5cm. I also cut strips of 2mm craft foam with a width of 0.5cm. Using Hexflex paints again, I primed the strip of foam before using more Hexflex paint to paint it silver. It took 3 coats before I was happy with the really deep metal effect. Taking the cut leather strips and the now painted foam strip, I very carefully and tightly wrapped the handle of the hammer. I have to say, this bit was probably the most stressful bit of the whole project. I really did not want to mess this up. Using a sharp blade, I very carefully trimmed off any excess from the top. To make the pommel of the hammer, I drew this up in AutoCAD and then laser cut it out onto 2mm craft foam. Taking one of the pieces that I'd cut out, I drew around the edge and then cut it off. This gave me a nice little strip that I used to make the edging around the pommel. I simply glued it in place with super glue. Then using my Dremel, I neatened up the edges and rounded them out a little bit. Then taking the laser cut details, I glued them on with super glue. I painted the pommel the same way I did the foam strip around the handle. I used black Hexflex paint as a primer and then I used silver over the top. Finally, to attach the pommel, I used contact adhesive. I was very careful to line the correct bit up with the hammerhead. For the final touch, I glued the leather handle to the base of the pommel. I also put 2 nails on the bottom to make sure it was secure. For the last bit, I filled in any small gaps with a little bit of craft clay, finally gluing on the little end piece that I'd made for the pommel. And this is the finished hammer. This project was actually my first ever commission and I really enjoyed making it, so I'm hoping that in the future I might take on a couple more. If you have any questions, then please leave them in the comments below. If you have any suggestions for things that you'd like to see me build, then also leave them in the comments. If you want to give it a go yourself, then as always, I'm going to leave the links for all of the things that I used in the video in the description below. I hope you enjoyed it and I'll see you next time.